Hi, I'm back again making videos again, and I'll continue with the Darwin series. I just took a little time out, as I mentioned before, to finish off this novel. It's basically a cli-fi novel, and it's called St. George and the Methane Dragon. I'll put a link to it below. It's not all doom and gloom, but it really is for doomers, and it imagines collapse from a Greek island. So I hope that I'll give you other dimensions on thinking about collapse, and even maybe help you a little bit if you're a bit depressed about collapse. But I look forward to any responses if you actually get it and read it. I'd love to know what people think, and maybe I will do another one if the response is good. Okay, but getting back to Darwin now. We left off last time with the Tree of Life, and I was trying to convince you that horizontal gene transfer was a big dent in Darwin's theory, something he didn't know about in his time and has only really been known about in very recent times. So the point of all of this is, just to get back to the meta-narrative, is really I'm analyzing exactly why we're about to go extinct, and one of the reasons is competition. Something that's really been saturated into our culture in the West is this idea of Darwinian competition, and the fact that it's gone so far that competition is considered healthy when actually it's pathological, and I'd like to show that to you, and I'll develop that over this series. But the next thing I want to investigate is the next dent that I want to put in Darwinism, and then eventually I'll get to an alternative theory which I think is more neutral and more scientific. The problem with Darwin's theory is it's not very scientific. He was an amateur scientist, an amateur botanist and biologist, and he did study things scientifically in a way, but he wasn't a rigorous scientist, and he was almost illiterate when it came to mathematics. And I think that's important, because my view of biology is it's actually doing computing and mathematics, and that was completely over Darwin's head.
For most animals, the reality of life is struggling, suffering, and death.
So overall, we believe in nature being red in tooth and claw and competitive, not because that's the evidence that comes from nature, but that's because the way our minds think. It's psychology. Darwin's theory was psychology and politics first, and then only afterwards biology.
Darwin's brilliance was to connect what he was seeing with an idea from a completely different discipline, economics. Thomas Malthus had written a popular, influential diatribe about the perils of population growth in early industrial Britain, and how this would inevitably be stopped by food shortage and disease. Darwin seized upon Malthus's warning about a human struggle for resources, and he applied it to what was happening in nature.
So in this episode then, I want to go over Lamarckism and epigenetics, the next big hole in Darwin's theory. Lamarck was a French naturalist who preceded Darwin by many decades. In the 18th century, he promoted the idea that biological evolution occurred according to natural laws. Lamarck believed that an organism could pass on physical characteristics that it acquired during its lifetime. The phrase "use it or lose it" harks back to Lamarck. He thought that the more an organ was used, the more it would be strengthened and enhanced, and that acquired characteristic could be passed on to progeny. And the converse also applied. If it wasn't used, it would wither away, and it wouldn't be passed on. Essentially, changes in the environment would change how an organ was used, and an organism could pass that change on to its progeny. Now, in biology classes, Lamarck is usually mentioned, ridiculed, and then dismissed derisively. Darwin's theory of evolution is presented as the one and only true mechanism of evolutionary change. St. Chuck himself wrote that Lamarck's theory was veritable rubbish. There was a myth in the 1950s that if you went to see platinum blonde film stars on the silver screen, then you would make sure that your kids turned out blonde. Now, that was considered absolutely mythical, and biology teachers would use it as an example of mythical pseudoscience and say that the only mechanism for transferring genetic inheritance is DNA. When the molecular structure of DNA was discovered in 1953, it became an article of faith a bit of dogma taught in biology classes that the DNA code could not be changed by anything in the environment during an organism's life. No acquired characteristic could be passed down.
To eke resources out of their particular surroundings. Longer necks are favoured to feed from tall trees.
If giraffes constantly were stretching their necks to reach vegetation, then that characteristic will be passed on, and the stretched neck would be passed on to the next generation, and that in turn would produce an even more stretched neck.
Today we know that Lamarck was basically wrong. Characteristics we acquire in our lifetimes aren't passed on to our children.
Lamarck had illustrated his idea by proposing that when a giraffe strained its neck by stretching for leaves on high branches, all that effort strengthened and lengthened its neck. And somehow that effort would be passed on to future generations. Lamarck argued for orthogenesis, which means that organisms have an innate tendency to evolve in the direction of a goal, and that goal was ever greater complexity. Lamarck eventually lost the argument because, as critics pointed out, no matter how much stretching the giraffe did, there was no possible way that that stretching could be transmitted all the way down from its neck to its genitals. And if it couldn't do that, it couldn't be passed on to the next generation. The logic was as cast iron and irrefutable as this statue. And as often happens with cast iron and irrefutable logic, it was also wrong. Turns out that Lamarck was actually right. Recently, his critics were proved wrong. There's a small isolated community called Överkalix in Norrbotten, the northernmost county of Sweden. During the early 19th century, the hardy people in this municipality experienced 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, just like in Egypt in the biblical story from the book of Genesis. In recent times, scientists from the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm did some painstaking research work in evaluating the history of feast and famine in Överkalix to see how it affected the lives of children. What they discovered was pure scientific heresy. Orthodox biology says that DNA sequences are passed down to offspring, but life experiences are supposed to die with the individual. The Swedish researchers found that wasn't true. The result of the study shows that the years the children were well fed, their offspring grew up to be healthier and physically bigger. Men who were grandsons of the Överkalix boys who had experienced a feast season when they were just pre-puberty died on average 6 years earlier than the grandsons of Överkalix boys who had been exposed to a famine during the same pre-puberty window. And often it was of diabetes. The data showed unequivocally that Överkalix grandfathers were somehow passing down brief but important childhood experiences to their grandsons. The epidemiological studies from Överkalix were defying Darwin's assertion that evolution takes place over millions of years. Evolution and environmental influence actually affects genes within 1 or 2 generations. Suddenly there was solid evidence that Darwin was wrong. It takes only 1 to 3 generations, not millennia, for evolution of genes to take place. But when the Swedish researchers tried submitting their discovery to scientific journals, they were shocked to find that no one was prepared to publish their discovery. It was rejected in peer review, not because the data was bad, not because of their statistics or method. It was rejected simply because of prejudice. The reviewers said such a thing could simply not happen. And that, boys and girls, is how science is really done. There's far more politics and prejudice than there is empiricism, especially when it comes to biology. It took over a decade until 2001 before the Överkalix researchers could find somebody that would publish their findings. And the reason for that is more and more researchers were beginning to find something similar. They were beginning to find that Darwin was actually wrong. There was more evidence coming from the Netherlands. In retaliation for a rail strike during World War II, the Germans deliberately cut off food shipments to Dutch citizens in the northwest section of the occupied Netherlands. The tremendous suffering that ensued in that pocket of the country became known as the Dutch Hunger Winter. A study discovered that children of mothers that were pregnant during the Dutch Hunger Winter were at heightened risk of diabetes, obesity, and schizophrenia later in life due to increased expression of IGF-2 genes. Just that one brief exposure to intense famine during pregnancy was somehow being passed down to offspring in their DNA. At around the same time, at the Institute of Child Health in London, doctors were baffled by a mystery surrounding children with a missing part of the DNA sequence from chromosome 15. The DNA deletion could be inherited from the father or the mother. The odd thing was that the DNA somehow seemed to have a memory of which parent the deletion was inherited from. If the DNA deletion was inherited from the father, the child had Prader-Willi syndrome, which caused insatiable hunger and leads to extreme obesity. But if the identical DNA deletion was inherited from the mother, it conferred Angelman syndrome, a severe mental impairment that leaves children unable to speak and with herky-jerky movement patterns. Somehow the DNA deletion on chromosome 15 had a record of whether it came from the father or mother. At that time, it made no sense. It wasn't until December 2018 until the Överkalix researchers were finally fully vindicated. A paper published in Nature with a dataset 40 times as big as the original research proved unequivocally that the original research was undoubtedly correct. So does that mean that Lamarck was resurrected? Well, no. Biologists had spent so long lampooning Lamarck that it was too embarrassing to do about-face and resurrect him. So they simply renamed Lamarckism Epigenetics. Epi means above in Greek, so it means the science of things that are above genetics. But how did epigenetics actually work? In 1975, two English biologists, Robin Holliday and John Pugh, and an American biologist, Arthur Riggs, independently suggested that methylation, a chemical modification of DNA that is heritable and can be induced by environmental influences, had an important part to play in gene expression. How it did this was not actually understood, but the idea gained ground in the scientific community.
The way these methyl groups control the genome is by binding to a gene and saying, do not express this gene. The methyl groups bind differently to your genome in a skin cell versus, say, a tongue cell or an eyeball cell. And that is one of the ways that a cell knows that, hey, I'm a skin cell, or hey, I'm an eyeball cell, or hey, I'm a muscle cell. In addition to methyl groups, epigenetics is also controlled by histones, which are proteins that are basically the spools that DNA winds itself around. Histones can change how tightly or loosely the DNA is wound around them. If they're more loosely wound, the genes can express more, and if they're more tightly wound, then they express less. So whereas the methyl groups are more like a switch, the histones are more like a knob. Every cell in your body has a distinct methylation and histone pattern. And that is what gives every cell its marching orders. Think of your genome, the DNA, as the actual hardware of the computer, while the epigenome is more like the software, which tells the hardware what to do.
But diehard Darwinists are bound to say, well, perhaps epigenetics is a recent Darwinian evolution. Maybe if you go back in deep time to the earliest part of life, there was only the Darwinian mechanism, and epigenetics came afterwards as an adaptation. Well, it turns out that that's not correct either. It turns out that epigenetics is extremely old. It goes right back to the dawn of life. But Darwinism itself, as I mentioned in the last part of this series, as you go further back in time, it becomes more and more subject to horizontal gene transfer. By the time you're talking about bacteria, you're talking about such extreme horizontal gene transfer that any signal of adaptation is completely lost in the noise. So Darwin's theory can't really apply to the simpler organisms. But the proof of the age and antiquity of epigenetics is in the branch of life called archaea. Archaea are single-celled microorganisms with a structure similar to bacteria. They are evolutionarily distinct from bacteria and eukaryotes and form the third domain of life. Archaea are a major part of Earth's life. They are part of the microbiota of all organisms, including the human microbiota. They are important in the gut, mouth, and on the skin. They play roles in the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. The word archaea comes from ancient Greek, meaning ancient things. For a long while they were classified as bacteria, But in 1977 they were finally recognized as a new domain of life. And they're extremely ancient. They branched off from eukaryotes millions of years ago. Scientists from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln observed evolution sans mutation in archaea. They watched microbes inherit extreme acid resistance in Yellowstone hot springs, not through genetics, but through epigenetics. So does evolutionary theory need a rethink? Some biologists say yes, urgently, and others say, what, are you kidding? And hand a propaganda coup to the creationists? Here's what the foremost Darwinian zealot has to say about epigenetics.
Do you think that epigenetic inheritance could give rise to what we could call a form of Lamarckian evolution?
As far as I am aware, epigenetics is all about embryology. Now, lately the word epigenetics has come to be used for a particular example of genes being turned on, and then the turning on being in some mysterious way inherited by the next generation. It's unfortunate that the word epigenetics has been usurped for that particular kind of inheritance. But given that it has, what you want to know, if it was to become the basis for a form of Lamarckian inheritance, is does it go on for many generations, or does it die away? And as far as I know, it dies away, if not in the next generation, in the next but one generation, if it happens at all. So that rules it out as a vehicle for evolution in the same way as mutation is a vehicle for evolution. It also, no, I think I've probably said enough. It might be interesting, the phenomena might be there, but if they are, we've got a very long way to go before we use this as an example of possible Lamarckian evolution. As far as I can tell, it is not that. And I think the word is being misused anyway.
It's ironic that Dawkins seems to be making some kind of argument against epigenetics based on dilution of genes. He seems to be saying that since epigenetics is diluted out after one or two generations, then it's not important for evolution. Why that's ironic is he seems to be forgetting one of the important periods in the evolution of Darwin's theory of evolution itself, and that's the period called the eclipse of Darwinism. People tend to forget these days that from about the 1860s until the 1920s, there was a period where Darwin's theory fell out of favor and was really forgotten. The reason it fell out of favor was because of the argument for dilution. At the time, the common theory of inheritance was a theory of blended inheritance. That's to say that somebody like you is a blend of all the traits from your mother's side and your father's side munged together. Fleeming Jenkin argued soon after The Origin of the Species came out that Darwin must be wrong because any beneficial trait would be diluted out very quickly. Now this is largely swept under the carpet today based on two fallacious counter-arguments. The first counter-argument was that Fleeming Jenkin and Darwin didn't understand genetic inheritance. Neither Darwin nor Jenkin had heard about Mendel's theory of genetic inheritance, the precursor to our modern theory of genetics. So the idea is that since Darwin and Jenkin didn't understand genetics, then basically the blended argument isn't really valid. Now that's not true at all. It's a very serious argument against Darwin. Fixing of genes is really quite a paradox for Darwin. Think, for example, of sexual dimorphism. Why would there be two sexes? Why would a selfish gene evolve to have two sexes? Every time the selfish gene propagates, it has a 50-50 chance of actually being completely diluted out. So in the first generation, a beneficial trait, a genetic mutation, would basically only be carried forward based on a coin toss. In the next generation, another coin toss. In the next generation, another coin toss again. To actually have a fixed gene, say in 5 generations, it means you have to throw heads on a coin 5 times in a row. So it's really hard to see why a selfish gene would evolve to have sex at all. It's far too carry-sharey. Now, one of the things that protects Darwinists from this counter-argument is the fact that when Fleeming Jenkin raised his argument, it was raised in a very racist way. The way he described how dilution might happen was to imagine, say, a Victorian gentleman, a white person, and obviously to a Victorian that meant a genetically superior person. Now, imagine that white male going to Africa to start a lineage. Well, in the very first generation, his supposedly superior genes would be diluted. His children would be mulattoes. The next generation would actually be more black than the mulattoes, and by the 3rd or 4th generation, they would be so black that they would be indistinguishable from the native population. Therefore, how could Darwinian traits stick? It may surprise you, for example, that genetic engineers are so cavalier about GMO crops, for example, and releasing GMO organisms into the wild. What lay people don't generally understand is that genetic engineers are so cavalier about releasing genetically engineered organisms into the wild because they don't really last very long. They get diluted out very quickly. So that's a serious argument against Darwinism. If you genetically engineer an organism, and even if that genetic engineering confers a beneficial trait, it soon is diluted out of the line. So the argument against Darwinism still stands to this day. But people tend to gloss over it or sweep it under the carpet, mainly because the original phrasing of the argument for dilution was so racist. People get hung up on the racism and they forget to focus on Jenkin's serious argument against Darwinism, and that's dilution. After Jenkin's argument, Darwin himself backtracked on his theory. He said it must be one of many mechanisms that is responsible for evolution, and we just don't know what those mechanisms are. But Darwin did stick with his idea to a certain extent. Darwin said he didn't know how, but it was his belief that beneficial traits would be conserved and become fixed. From that point on, Darwin's theory ceased being science and started to be faith-based. It became a religion at that point. It's a faith-based science. It's not really based on evidence, even though people like Dickie Dawkins insist that it is. Now, as a religion, of course, the acolytes of this religion, the high priests like Dickie Dawkins, refuse to give up. And they say that epigenetics just reaffirms Darwin's theory. It's basically the kind of backflips that theologians do to support religion. You can never win with Darwinists, because whatever you say, they just say, yes, that's further evidence for Darwinian evolution. So now even epigenetics, they say, well, that's just more things for the environment to select against. But it's a weasel tactic, because if you go back to what the Darwinian mechanism actually is, it needs the selfish gene. All I have to say is, please, God, I beg you, Dickie Dawkins, spare the world another one of your works of science fiction, and don't go and write the selfish epigenome now. Now, if you're one of those ever so clever conformist biologists, one of those that is just clever enough to do their job, but not clever enough to question what they're taught, your head's probably exploding now at the mere thought that your Darwinian religion is being questioned. So let's go back to Darwin's theory and Darwin's mechanism, what he actually said. Evolution is not Darwin's theory. Even Lamarck believed in evolution. Here's Darwin's theory. Let's go over it once again.
The idea of a rapid increase in population, which inevitably would lead to competition. And it was that was the spark that lit in Darwin's mind. Overproduction, which naturally every creature does. You get more children produced than can ever possibly survive. That leads to competition, competition, competition.
He believed that the world's population was expanding faster than the food supplies, and that people would have to compete in a fight for survival.
So the individuals that survive and the individuals that reproduce are the ones that are best at surviving and best at reproducing.
So you see, at the heart of Darwin's theory is competition, and competition itself is pseudoscience. It's actually to do with our psychology. Once again, Darwin's theory doesn't come from evidence from nature. It is really our own psychology, and in particular the psychology of this part of your brain, what I call the alien cortex, projected onto nature. It's an interpretation, and it's an invalid interpretation because that's not what the evidence is saying. It is basically a pathological interpretation that is based on competition. Competition itself is pseudoscience. There is no maths for competition. If the environment can actually alter the genes and mold the organism without the Darwinian mechanism, what is Darwin's contribution to evolution? The answer? Nothing at all. So really it is high time to throw out Darwin's wacky old faith-based theory. It just doesn't hold water in the science of today. But why do people like Dickie Dawkins cling to it with such religious tenacity? Why is Dickie Dawkins such a zealot?
When I was a young boy, I looked to God to explain life. And then I was introduced to Darwin and evolution by my father. At first I didn't get it. It didn't seem possible to me that something so simple could explain so much. And then suddenly the penny dropped. I really got it. At that moment, I became an atheist, and I've never looked back.
Darwinism is religion. It's as bad as creationism. As Dickie Dawkins well knows, it's time to get rid of all these phony religions. Let's get rid of both of them. This idea that nature is all about competition and survival of the fittest, in Herbert Spencer and Wallace's phrase, is nonsense. In the next episode, we'll look at this issue more closely. And spoiler alert, there's no competition in nature. It's all in your head.
We evolved in the ruthless competition of nature. Darwin himself was shocked by what he called the low and horridly cruel behavior he observed in nature. Now he contemplated the brutal reality. How does nature select? In the cruelest way.
That's what life is like. It's suffering. That's what the religious people have always said. Life is suffering. Yes.